Welcome to the world of ancient lawmaking, where the punishments were public, the logic was non-existent, and the gods were always somehow angrier than last week. From ghost weddings in Sumer to theft fines in Hittite court, from getting taxed after death in Egypt to being banned from eye contact in Persia, these weren't just laws. They were nightmares with official seals. So no, you wouldn't last a day in any of these civilizations. And if you did, it's probably because you were blind, mute, or very, very lucky. History wasn't dignified. It was petty, brutal, and weirdly obsessed with purple fabric. If you're into history that makes you laugh, cringe, and thank the modern world for not punishing sneezing, hit that like, smash subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single insane law from humanity's legal dumpster fire. Leave a comment with the ancient civilization you want us to roast next, and we might dig up their weirdest laws just for you. Once upon a terrifying time in the ancient city of Babylon, where bricks were sunbaked and gods had serious anger issues, there existed a law so aggressively direct, it skipped the whole trial thing and went straight to, if your house collapses and kills someone, congrats, you're next. This delightful nugget of logic came courtesy of King Hammurabi, a man whose idea of fair lawmaking involved writing 282 stone-carved rules so harsh, even the dust looked nervous. It was the original terms and conditions, except instead of clicking "I agree," you bled publicly and probably by decree. Let's say you're a Babylonian builder. Life's already hard. You've got a hammer made of river rock, blueprints drawn by someone who might have been drunk, and your workers are 6 guys with no shoes and chronic sunstroke. And yet, you build. You stack. You pray. You curse gravity. Then one day, one of your houses, not even your own, mind you, but one you built for that loud pottery merchant with questionable breath, collapses, and it lands on someone's son. You are immediately, legally, and ceremonially screwed. According to Law 229 of Hammurabi's Code, if a builder constructs a house and it falls, killing the owner's son, the builder's own son must also be put to death. Yes, you read that right. Not the builder himself. His kid. Because Hammurabi said justice should be eye for an eye, or more accurately, child for a child, even if the kid in question had never seen a ladder in his life. And if the house just injured someone, you don't get off easy, you get maimed. Your hand gets chopped off. Did you build the house with your hand? Of course. Will you ever build another one? Not anymore. Now, let's really sit with this. Imagine you're the son of a Babylonian builder. You wake up every day praying that your dad tightened the ceiling joists correctly. You're 7, trying to learn cuneiform, and meanwhile, your life hangs on whether Dad was hungover when he installed that corner beam. And what if you're the builder? You're not just building walls anymore. You're playing God with your own bloodline. You're sweating mortar while imagining your kid's tiny head on the chopping block because you miscalculated how much straw to mix into the clay. Suddenly, construction safety isn't about hard hats. It's about not getting your entire family executed. And that's just if the house falls on a person. If the building just collapsed without casualties, you're still expected to rebuild it at your own expense and possibly face public punishment, fines, or humiliation. Maybe all 3. Did Babylon have permits? Building inspections? Zoning boards? Of course not. You were the blueprint, the labor, and the insurance policy, all rolled into one terrified, underpaid, oversweating mortal. And guess what? These laws were carved in stone. Literally. On a 7-foot slab that screamed, "Mess up once, and we'll ruin your lineage." This wasn't just about justice. This was about vengeance disguised as law. One kid dies in a freak construction accident, and Hammurabi's like, cool, kill another one. Forget due process. Ancient Babylon preferred doomed process. And heaven help you if the guy whose house you built was rich. Because while you're out there trying not to cough blood into your plaster mix, They're making sure the royal guards know exactly whose kid to collect when their roof leaks. No one had your back, except maybe the back of your own house, which, if it cracked, well, you better start writing your will on a clay tablet and hiding your children. Because in Babylon, the walls had ears, and if one of those walls fell, you'd be buried next to your reputation. Ah, ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, eyeliner, sun gods, and enough laws to make you regret being born near the Nile. A place where the dead got better housing than the living, cats had more legal protection than your children, and, wait for it, statues were legally required to be dressed appropriately. Yes, you heard that right. Statues. Not priests. Not peasants. Not merchants. Statues. Because if you were a sculptor in Egypt, it wasn't enough to carve a lifelike likeness of Pharaoh or some rich noble who thought their chin deserved eternal granite glory. You also had to make sure their statue was dressed properly, as in modest, God-fearing, and fashionably immortal. Why? Because in ancient Egypt, statues weren't just art. They were literal stand-ins for the people they depicted, spiritual proxies, cosmic decoys. The belief was that the soul, the Ka, could inhabit the statue in the afterlife. So if your statue was naked, improperly dressed, or, heaven forbid, wearing outdated ceremonial gear, then congratulations. You've just condemned someone's soul to spend eternity looking like a fool. And guess whose fault that was? Yours. The artist. The craftsman. The guy who thought he was just chiseling a dude in a skirt. And now suddenly you're on trial for cosmic nudity. There were actual guidelines. Not official statue style codes 101. But enough ritual standards passed around by temple scribes and overseers that if you got it wrong, the wrong headdress, missing kilt folds, sandals too casual, you could be accused of sacrilege. Yes, sacrilege. Because nothing angered the gods like fashion crimes in limestone. And the standards, they were weirdly specific. Pharaohs had to wear the Nemes headdress, that striped cloth thing that made them look like they were cosplaying a cobra. Certain statues had to include a ceremonial beard, even if the real person couldn't grow one. And gods forbid you carved a queen without her appropriate wig. She might curse your family from beyond. Some priests even insisted that statues be ritually dressed during certain festivals. This means actual priests dressing actual statues in miniature clothes, changing their outfits seasonally, like they were Barbie dolls of doom. Imagine walking into a temple and seeing 5 grown men solemnly wrapping linen around a 6-foot statue while chanting. That's not a comedy sketch. That was real temple protocol. And here's the kicker. If you made a statue that was too lifelike, so lifelike it could offend the gods by looking more human than divine, you could also be punished. So you had to walk a fine line between spiritually powerful and not too sexy. Which, to be fair, is still relatable. Now think of the pressure on the sculptors. You're out there under the sun, covered in rock dust, trying to remember whether the 3rd dynasty pharaohs preferred flat sandals or elevated ones. One mistake, and some high priest is accusing you of spiritually humiliating a king who's been dead for 300 years. And meanwhile, your actual clothes? You're lucky if your loincloth isn't falling off mid-sculpt. Because in ancient Egypt, if you walked into a temple half-naked, people would just nod and keep walking. But if your statue walked into the afterlife without the right belt, that was a national crisis. Sparta. The name alone conjures images of chiseled warriors screaming in slow motion, kicking Persians into metaphorical pits, and generally behaving like testosterone incarnate. But behind the abs and the war chants was a legal system so aggressively macho, it made gladiator fights look like pillow slaps. You see, in Sparta, bravery wasn't just encouraged. It was legally required, like actually written into the system. If you ran away from battle, showed fear, or survived when everyone else heroically died, the city didn't just frown upon you. It branded you a coward legally. And what came next? Oh, just a lifetime of institutional humiliation. First off, you'd lose citizenship privileges. That meant no voting, no landowning, no participating in state decisions, because clearly you had forfeited the right to think by failing to die correctly. Then there was the public shaming. You couldn't marry. You had to wear special clothing, sometimes rags, sometimes a half beard, because apparently shaving half your face was the ancient Greek version of wearing a dunce cap. You weren't allowed to speak first in public. People could literally avoid eye contact with you by law. And just in case that wasn't enough, children were taught to mock you in the streets. Yes, Sparta wrote humiliation into the curriculum. You didn't just get judged, you became a walking civics lesson in failure. Let's say your unit went into battle. Everyone died. You lived. Maybe you were wounded. Maybe you were the only one who didn't faint from blood loss and exhaustion. Doesn't matter. If you didn't come home with victory or death, you came home a criminal. Because in Sparta, survival wasn't success. Survival meant you didn't try hard enough to die gloriously. There's a documented case of Spartan warriors banishing their own commander for retreating. Never mind that the retreat was tactically sound. Never mind that it saved lives. No shield, no honor. And in Sparta, losing your shield was a serious legal offense. Not because it was valuable, but because it protected your comrades. Lose your spear? Fine. Lose your helmet? Okay. Lose your shield? You might as well wear a toga that says coward and live in a ditch. And it wasn't just men. Even Spartan mothers were in on it. If a son came home alive but not victorious, the legendary saying was, "Come back with your shield or on it." That wasn't poetry. That was legal, cultural, and maternal policy. Now picture this. You're limping home from war. You've watched your friends die. Your legs full of arrows. You haven't slept in 3 days. You drag yourself through the city gates hoping for water and rest. And instead, the law greets you with, "Coward. Shame. You're not even allowed to sit near us at dinner." Imagine trying to buy barley and being told, "Sorry, this market doesn't serve failure." That was Sparta. So no, cowardice wasn't a moral flaw. It was a crime, punishable by legal exile, social death, and a full-time job as the village punchline. Because in ancient Sparta, bravery wasn't about choice. It was mandatory. And if you didn't meet the standard, they didn't bury you. They erased you. Let's talk about adultery in ancient Rome. A land where political corruption was an art form, public executions were crowd pleasers, and technically it was perfectly legal to own 400 slaves. But don't you dare cheat on your husband, because then you've crossed a line. And by line, we mean the line between having a face and not. Now, Roman marriage was less about love and more about land, alliances, and baby-making. That didn't stop people from sneaking around. It just meant that when they got caught, things got very ugly very quickly. Especially if you were a woman. Because, surprise, Roman law was sexist as hell. According to the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis, which sounds like a bad vacation package but actually means the Julia law on adultery control, adultery wasn't just shameful, it was criminal. And the punishment varied. But it could involve public shaming, exile, property seizure, or having your nose sliced off. Yes, nose off. Because in certain Roman provinces, especially under harsh local magistrates and during later imperial crackdowns, cutting off the nose of an adulteress became a legally permitted punishment. Why the nose? Because it was visible. Because it marked you. Because ancient men had a very weird obsession with turning personal betrayal into facial branding. And don't even think about protesting. Because your husband? He could literally kill both you and your lover, legally, if he caught you mid-act. It was called ius occidendi, the right to kill. And in Roman legal fashion, it came with just enough fine print to pretend it wasn't barbaric. Now, if you were a man, caught cheating, oh no, you weren't mutilated. You were maybe scolded, fined, or told not to sleep with another man's wife. Because Roman society didn't care what you did with your body, as long as you didn't mess with another man's property, which, in their eyes, included his wife. The Romans even had a designated pimp tax. You could profit from adultery if it was organized, public, and taxable. But if a woman privately pursued her own affair, out came the knives. And yes, the nose wasn't always part of the sentence. It was often a local variation, popular in border regions and eastern provinces where Roman law fused with older, more brutal customs. But even in the urban heart of Rome, the punishment for infidelity could be devastating. Loss of citizenship, forced exile to some mosquito-infested island, or being publicly paraded through the streets as a cautionary tale with a placard naming your crime. Because nothing says healthy marriage laws like public humiliation, disfigurement, and mild execution. Now imagine you're a Roman woman. Your husband sleeps around like Jupiter in heat. But you glance a little too long at the olive vendor and suddenly you're on trial for emotional treason. And if you actually fall in love with someone else, better run, because your next profile picture might be missing a nose. All in the name of public morality. Because in ancient Rome, love wasn't blind, but it was definitely legally dangerous. Let's get this out of the way first. Yes, the Chinese government really officially banned time travel. Not time travel itself because, physics, but the concept of time travel, especially in movies, TV shows, novels, and any other media that dared suggest messing with the timeline. And no, this wasn't some ancient Han Dynasty scroll screaming, "No flux capacitors allowed." This happened in 2011. Yep, recent enough that some of you reading this were probably alive on the internet and watching a time travel drama when it got pulled off the air mid-season. Here's how it happened. In the early 2000s, Chinese audiences got obsessed with time travel stories. Think modern people falling into wells, touching ancient relics, or getting struck by lightning and waking up in the Qing dynasty. 1 minute you're texting, the next you're dodging Mongols and marrying emperors. It was campy, chaotic, and honestly kind of amazing. But to the Chinese censors, this was a problem. Because these shows didn't just have characters galloping through time, they were changing history as they went. Rewriting emperors, satirizing ancient customs, mocking Confucianism, sometimes flirting with royalty, unforgivable things like fun. So in 2011, the State Administration of Radio, Film and Television, SARFT, the acronym of joy killing, issued a notice. Time travel dramas, and all works that casually make up myths, have monsters or absurd plots, use fictional techniques to distort historical events, were now banned. The official reason? They were frivolous, unserious, and disrespectful to history. Also, they encouraged audiences to believe that changing the past was somehow possible, desirable, or, gasp, subversive. Which is kind of hilarious, coming from a government that regularly edits its own textbooks. So let's recap. You could still watch heroic war dramas, decades-long soap operas about imperial concubines, or deeply sanitized documentaries about the glorious revolution. But the second someone slipped through a wormhole, poof, illegal. This ban wasn't just about genre. It was about control. In China, the past is sacred but also state-approved. So if you go back in time, you better not suggest that any ancient dynasty made a mistake. You better not have a time-traveling janitor outsmarting a corrupt minister. And you definitely better not let some 21st century girl in sneakers fall in love with the emperor. That's sedition, with eyeliner. And it didn't stop with TV. Novels were censored. Web stories got pulled. Authors had to rewrite their time travel plots to make them dreams or hallucinations just to get published. Imagine pitching Back to the Future in China. No sorry, Marty. If you kiss your mom in the past and it alters the future, we'll have to send you to a re-education camp. The irony? China has one of the longest, most documented histories in the world. You'd think they'd be cool with people wanting to visit it, even fictionally. But nope, they ban time travel to protect the timeline. Not from paradoxes, from free thought. Because in authoritarian logic, even imaginary anarchy is too much. Let's set the scene. You're a citizen of classical Athens. You've served in war, delivered inspiring speeches, and maybe even passed a few laws that weren't completely terrible. People respect you. They cheer for you in the agora. You're a rising star. And that's exactly the problem. Because in ancient Athens, if you became too powerful, too charming, or too competent, people started to wonder, wait, is he about to become a tyrant? And then, just to be safe, they voted to yeet you out of the city for 10 years. Yes, you didn't have to commit a crime. You didn't have to start a coup. You just had to be a little too popular, and the voters would whip out their pottery shards and send you packing. This was called ostracism. From the Greek word ostracon, which means broken pottery, the ancient version of a ballot, citizens would scratch your name onto a shard and drop it into a big urn. If enough people voted for you, boom, exile. 10 years. No trial. No appeal. Pack your tunic. Imagine running for office in modern times and your approval rating hits 70%. And suddenly the government's like, okay, that's suspicious. Get out of the country. And remember, Athens invented democracy. But apparently, that democracy came with a built-in self-destruct button for anyone who was too good at playing the game. The logic was this: Athens had experienced real tyrants before. Not mean tweets tyrants, actual autocrats who seized power, canceled freedoms, and built creepy statues of themselves. So to prevent that from happening again, they figured, let's get rid of anyone who might become a tyrant before they even try. And what was the threshold for suspicion? Too many friends, too many speeches, too many people naming their kids after you. You didn't even have to do anything illegal. You just had to give off dictator vibes. And if you were ostracized, you weren't imprisoned. You weren't executed. You were just exiled, sent to go farm olives in some dusty corner of nowhere until everyone forgot your name or someone else got more suspicious. And when your 10 years were up, you could come back like nothing happened. No grudge, no formal record. Just, oh hey, you're back. Sorry, we thought you were gonna enslave the city. My bad. The worst part? It wasn't even consistent. Some years, the Athenians skipped ostracism entirely. Other years, they booted out brilliant military leaders, popular reformers, and once a guy who probably just talked too much at dinner. Because this wasn't law. This was vibes-based mob panic dressed up as civic virtue. In fact, one of the most famous victims of ostracism was Aristides the Just. The guy was so well respected, people literally called him the Just. And someone still voted him out because, and this is true, they were sick of hearing him called that all the time. Yes, someone voted to exile a man for being too morally upright, too admired, too damn decent. That's democracy, baby. So in Athens, if you wanted to succeed, you had to walk a fine line. Popular enough to matter, but not so popular that people started whispering tyrant. Because in the birthplace of reason and logic, jealousy had its own legal process. Let's say you're a father in ancient Babylon. You come home after a long day chiseling mud bricks and making sure you don't offend any sky gods. Your son mouths off, maybe even raises a hand. Shocking, disrespectful, rebellious. Time to drown him. No, really, that was the law. According to the infamous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest and most detailed legal codes ever etched into stone. If a son struck his father, it wasn't time for a lecture, a timeout, or a dramatic family dinner. Nope, you were legally allowed to end him. By drowning. publicly, ceremonially, as in, tie the kid up, toss him in the river, and let justice flow like the Euphrates. Because in Babylon, parental authority wasn't just respected, it was worshipped like a minor deity with a zero-tolerance policy. Now let's add some context, because this wasn't just your average teenage tantrum. Babylonian society was built on honor, hierarchy, and the belief that defying authority unraveled the whole cosmic order. If a child struck a parent, especially a father, it wasn't just a personal insult. It was considered a divine offense, one that polluted the entire family. So Hammurabi's Law 195 didn't just say, "This is bad." It said, "This is punishable by liquid execution." And if you think this was rare, think again. Babylonian law had a whole section on family crimes. If a son disrespected a parent, flogging. If a father disowned a son without legal grounds, the court could force him to take the kid back. But if the son raised a hand in anger, all bets were off. Grab the rope, start the ritual, book the river, and don't expect your mother to save you. Babylon wasn't big on courtroom drama. If the evidence, or the dad's word, supported the claim, you were done. The law didn't require a long trial. It required obedience. And if you failed that test, the river would wash your shame away. Literally. Now imagine you're a teenager in Babylon. You're grumpy, hungry, just found out your sheepskin crush is marrying someone else. You slam the door on your dad. Congratulations. That's striking behavior. Better start swimming. And it didn't matter why you hit him. Maybe your dad was abusive. Maybe he was drunk on date wine and trying to sell your sister for grain. Didn't matter. The law didn't ask why. It asked who. And if that who was your father, and the what was your fist, you were legally river food. Now let's say you survive this. You get let off somehow. Maybe the priest intervenes. Your relationship is ruined forever, sure, but also so is your reputation. Because in a society where family honor was everything, being labeled a disrespectful son was like being branded a traitor. Employers wouldn't hire you. Neighbors wouldn't talk to you. The temple wouldn't bless your crops. And good luck getting married. Because what woman wants to tie herself to a guy whose legal status is almost drowned by dad? And don't forget, Babylon loved public punishment. So if the execution did go through, it wouldn't be some quiet affair. It would be a full-on spectacle. Crowds watching, priests chanting. One last gasp before you're dragged under, not by water but by a legal system that thought this was normal. Because in Babylon, obedience wasn't a virtue. It was the law. And breaking it didn't mean losing trust. It meant losing your lungs. Bandits, or maybe you led a victorious cavalry charge against some Greeks who didn't appreciate being conquered. The King of Kings is pleased. Everyone's cheering. You're the toast of the empire. And then the royal court says, "Congratulations. You may now commit one crime. No questions asked." Yes, that was real. According to ancient records, particularly Greco-Persian historians like Herodotus, who loved writing dramatic things down whether they were confirmed or not, but were often weirdly right, Persian law had a get-out-of-jail-free card for military heroes and other imperial MVPs. The rule was simple. If you had performed an extraordinary service to the empire, you were granted the legal right to break the law. Once. Any law. Without punishment. Murder? Sure. Theft? Go for it. Punch a noble in the face? Just say, "I saved the empire," and walk away like it's Tuesday. Now, was this official law code carved in cuneiform and displayed in every city square? Probably not. But it was documented as a custom, particularly under the Achaemenid dynasty, the same folks who gave us Darius the Great, massive roads, satraps, and mandatory beard maintenance. And like all things ancient and royal, it was both honor and trap. Because yes, you could technically commit a crime, but everyone knew you did it. Your name was recorded. Your reputation became the hero who also stabbed a guy over goats. And if you used your free crime unwisely, say, to sleep with a noble's wife or insult a priest, you'd better believe that next time you needed a favor from the king, he'd be like, "Sorry, that was your one. Should have saved it for treason." This law or custom was part of a broader Persian concept of honor through balance. You do great good, you earn leeway, but that leeway was finite. Once a year, once per act of heroism. Use it wisely or lose it pathetically. So let's run a few scenarios. Scenario 1. You save a royal city from a rebel army. The court says, "Well done." You go out, get drunk, and accidentally set a temple on fire. Everyone gasps. You shrug and say, "One crime, baby." Case closed. Scenario 2. You steal a neighbor's prized camel. They report you. You reply, "I took an arrow for the king at the Battle of Pasargadae." The judge waves you through. Scenario 3. You hoard your free crime like a coupon. 10 years pass. You forget you have it. Then one day someone tries to tax your apricot orchard, and you scream, "Now!" and uppercut a tax official. Totally legal. It's insane. And somehow, kind of genius? Because it shows how much the Persian Empire valued loyalty and heroism. They didn't just say, "Thank you." They said, "You get one legal sin. Use it however you want. Just don't make us regret it." Of course, most citizens didn't qualify. This was for the elite, the war heroes, the backsavers of the empire. You, a humble farmer who helped a guard find his missing sandal? Sorry. That's not worth a crime. Try again after you conquer a province. So in Persia, being a legend came with perks. And those perks included the right to break the law just a little. Because even in ancient times, everyone loves a hero, especially when they only punch one person a year. Let's rewind to around 1754 BCE in Babylon, a city where people built with mud, worshipped storm gods, and solved most problems using either a goat or a decapitation. And then along comes Hammurabi, warrior, lawgiver, and king with a serious flair for drama. He decides his kingdom needs order. Not just laws, but divinely ordained. One size kills all legislation, engraved into an 8-foot black monolith that said, "These rules are from the gods. So mess up, and may Marduk have mercy on your limbs." Thus, the Code of Hammurabi was born. 282 laws, etched permanently in stone, and not a single one of them subtle. Let's take a peek at the greatest hits, shall we? Law 1. If a man accuses another of a crime, but can't prove it, he shall be killed. Right out the gate, no warnings. Just boom. Accuse wrong, die. Hope you weren't just gossiping. Law 3. If a judge gives a faulty judgment, he shall be fined, removed from office, and never judge again. Imagine this in modern courts. "Sorry, Your Honor, you misread the parking ticket case. Now hand over your robe and get out." Law 6. If someone steals something from a temple or palace, they shall be killed. Not fined, not jailed, dead. Divine property was off limits, and Babylon meant it. And then it gets creative. Law 196. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. Classic eye for an eye stuff. Biblical, brutal, beautifully simple. But wait, it gets weirder. Because Hammurabi's code cared a lot about class. Let's say you were a noble, and you harmed another noble. You get hurt back 1 for 1. But if you were a noble who hurt a commoner, you pay a fine. And if you were a commoner who hurt a noble, prepare to die. Same crime. Wildly different outcomes. It's like justice, but only for the upper crust. Let's not forget the architectural laws. Law 229. If a builder constructs a house and it collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. Didn't double-check your bricks? Time to get flattened. By law. Law 230. If it kills the owner's son, the builder's son shall be killed. Yes, your son. Even if he was just at home playing with a mud doll. Because the Babylonians believed in generational justice, or as we'd now call it, legally endorsed blood feuds. And how about the family laws? Law 128. If a man takes a wife but doesn't sign the marriage contract, she's not legally his. Because in Babylon, paperwork was more sacred than love. Law 129. If a wife is caught in adultery, she and her lover shall be tied and thrown in the river. You know, just casually adding ritual drowning to your marriage counseling plan. But here's the strangest part. To Hammurabi, this was merciful. This was progress. Before this code, people were just winging it. Mob justice, tribal revenge, priestly guesswork. So Hammurabi said, let's fix this, and created a massive legal cheat sheet so everyone knew exactly how they'd die when they messed up. And yet, despite its horrors, the code had some surprisingly forward-thinking moments. Wages were regulated. Doctors had fee schedules. Merchants had liability protections. So if you sold someone bad beer, you might not die, just pay a fine. Unless you sold it to the temple. Then it was death. Again. The code wasn't just about blood. It was about control, one king's way to prove that law came from above. And that every brick, trade, insult, and pregnancy could be weighed, measured, and judged. And it worked for a while. The code spread. Other empires copied it. Even thousands of years later, we still talk about an eye for an eye, like it's some kind of poetic fairness. But really, it was just Hammurabi saying, follow the rules, or the river gets fed again. Okay, quick clarification. No, the Romans didn't execute you for smashing a glass mirror from Bed Bath & Beyond. They'd never heard of that place. But they absolutely believed that breaking the mirror of Roman virtue, reputation, or public decorum was an act of treason, and sometimes execution-worthy. Let's break it down. Pun very intended. The Romans were obsessed with appearances, not just clothing or posture, but how your life reflected your moral standing. Everything was symbolic. Your family name was sacred. Your home, a monument to your ancestors. Your behavior in public, a mirror held up to Roman civilization itself. So when someone broke the mirror, they weren't just misbehaving. They were cracking the illusion that Rome was orderly, honorable, divine, and eternal. Let's say you were a senator. You got caught embezzling, cheating on your wife, or even wearing purple when you weren't the emperor. Boom. Scandal. Mirror broken. Time to die. The punishment wasn't for the crime itself half the time. It was for the image you shattered. Because your disgrace didn't just make you look bad. It reflected on Rome. And Rome? Rome couldn't have cracks. That's why there were laws against performing in public if you were from the upper classes. Not because dancing was bad, but because it was un-Roman. It damaged the societal mirror of noble dignity. Even bad poetry could ruin you. If you wrote satire that mocked the emperor, the court could argue that your words distorted the image of Rome, and down you'd go. Hi, Ovid. Enjoy your exile. Or maybe you were a woman of noble birth caught drinking too much wine, or appearing in public without a veil. Scandalous. Immoral. Mirror shattered. For women, this could mean exile. For men, death. Now let's talk about damnatio memoriae. Literally, the condemnation of memory. If someone offended Rome badly enough, they weren't just punished. They were erased. Statues destroyed. Names chiseled off monuments. Images scratched from coins. It was as if Rome looked in its mirror, saw a blemish, and decided to break the entire frame. Emperor Domitian, wiped from memory. Elagabalus, deleted. Get too weird, too deviant, too un-Roman, and the mirror cracks. Rome panics, and you vanish. Sometimes even your associates were punished. Guilt by reflection. Rome couldn't risk the illusion unraveling. And here's the kicker. They believed the mirror was magical, not metaphorical. To shatter the dignity of Rome was to literally endanger the gods' favor. So punishing you wasn't just civic. It was spiritual maintenance. It's like the whole empire had body dysmorphia, and the punishment for being the pimple on its nose was execution. So no, Romans didn't have a law that said, break a mirror, die. But they had hundreds of laws that said, if you damage the image of Rome, of your class, of the gods, of your ancestors, you are no longer worthy of life. And they meant it. In the end, Rome didn't fear violence. It feared shame. And when shame showed up, they smashed it. Even if that meant smashing you. Let's set the stage. You're in the Heian Court, a dazzling palace filled with poetry, painted screens, and more rules than sense. The emperor is seated on a golden dais. Priests are chanting. Incense curls through the air like divine spaghetti. Everyone is still, silent, reverent, and then you sneeze. Game over. You've just committed an unspeakable breach of etiquette. Not just gross, sacrilegious, because in early Japan, especially during the height of the imperial cult, the emperor wasn't just a political figure, he was divine, like literally descended from the gods. So when you sneezed during a ritual, you didn't just interrupt a prayer. You corrupted the sacred space. You shattered the spiritual flow. You defiled the moment, all because your nose had trust issues. And trust us, they had laws for that. Strict bans on sneezing during imperial ceremonies were written into codes of court conduct, some dating back as early as the Taiho Code, early 8th century, and echoed in the Euro Code. These weren't suggestions. They were sacred mandates. If you felt a sneeze coming, you better leave the room, hold your breath, pinch your face, pray. Because if you sneezed in front of the emperor or, heaven forbid, during a major ritual like the enthronement ceremony or a divine offering, the entire rite might have to be paused, cleansed, or restarted. Why? Because the act of sneezing wasn't just annoying. It was seen as a sign of spiritual impurity, an uncontrolled bodily eruption, a reminder that you were flesh and mucus in a place meant for the gods. Imagine the spiritual stakes. You're standing at the edge of the mortal world, trying to open a gateway to heaven, and someone explodes out of their face. Not ideal. And of course, this being Japan, the punishment wasn't always violent. You probably wouldn't be executed for sneezing, unless you did it a lot. But you could be stripped of rank, exiled from court, assigned humiliating duties, like cleaning ritual spaces for a month with a shame towel, required to perform purification rituals involving water, salt, and maybe don't ever do that again energy. And this wasn't just a one-time historical footnote. Even in Edo period Japan, hundreds of years later, there were formal writings on the importance of controlling bodily functions during ceremonies. Samurai were trained to suppress sneezes. Priests carried cloths not for wiping, but for smothering sudden dishonor. It went beyond sneezing too. Burping? Banned. Coughing? Keep it in. Sniffling? Leave the palace, peasant. Because in ancient Japan, silence wasn't just golden, it was sacred. And get this, if the emperor sneezed, that was different. His sneeze was divine, a sign from the heavens. People would bow. Priests might interpret it. You sneeze? You're a moist disgrace to the realm. So the next time you're at a formal event and feel a sneeze coming on, be glad you're not in 9th century Kyoto, standing beside the sacred throne, with a twitching nose and an entire lineage on the line. Because back then, one sneeze could destroy a ceremony and your career. Let's start with the basics. Beer in Mesopotamia wasn't just a drink. It was life. It was currency. It was medicine, religion, and breakfast. Seriously, people drank it with straws out of ceramic vats like it was a divine smoothie. And the Sumerians? They didn't just enjoy beer. They worshipped it. Literally. They had a beer goddess. Her name was Ninkasi, and she was the divine patroness of fermentation. There was even a hymn to her that doubled as a recipe, because multitasking is holy. So, you can imagine how seriously the Mesopotamians took the brewing process. This wasn't a frat party. This was sacred ritual. And if you messed it up, you didn't just disappoint customers. You disappointed the gods. Enter the Code of Hammurabi, a 4,000-year-old legal system written in stone, obsessed with justice, grain, and public drowning. Now let's look at a few specific laws. Law 108. If a tavern keeper, usually a woman, gave short measure of beer for silver, she shall be drowned. Let that sink in. Watered down beer? Death. Underpoured pint? Death. Overcharging? Death. They didn't sue you. They didn't fine you. They tied you up and chucked you in the river like expired barley. Why? Because beer wasn't just beer. It was part of the state economy. Taverns acted like ancient banks. You could pay wages in beer. You could make offerings in beer. Beer was rationed by the temple. So if you tampered with the quality or quantity of the sacred brew, you weren't just a bad bartender. You were a financial terrorist. Oh, and if you ran a tavern and let your bar become a hotspot for shady political gossip or criminal plotting, you could be executed for sedition. No joke. Bars weren't just fun places. They were monitored, because bad beer could lead to drunken priests, angry laborers, corrupt scribes, and a city full of half-sober revolutionaries. Even priests had beer allowances. Even slaves got daily rations. And guess what? If the beer wasn't up to standard, there was a whole complaints process. Except instead of, "Can I speak to your manager?" it was more like, "Can I speak to your gods while you're tied in a sack?" And don't think you could just apologize. Apologies didn't count when it came to sacred beverages. The assumption was, if you served bad beer, you were either a thief, a liar, or possessed by demons who hated agriculture. It gets better. In some regions, it was considered a moral failing to brew improperly. Bad beer wasn't just illegal. It meant your soul was unclean. So if your brew was too sour or flat, you didn't just ruin someone's day. You risked inviting famine, plague, or divine wrath on the entire city. No pressure. So yes, in Mesopotamia, you could be punished for bad beer. And not just punished, erased. Because the gods demanded foam, flavor, and fairness. And if your tavern poured disrespect into a cup, the river waited. Let's set the dusty scene. You're a poor worker in Thebes. Your rations are low, your sandals are thin, and the royal tombs just across the river, stuffed with gold, amulets, linen, and the eternal dreams of pharaohs. And best of all, they're just lying there, sealed in stone, yes, but unattended. You gather a few desperate friends, sneak in at night, crack open a sarcophagus, pocket a gold pendant, and bam, you've broken about 7 laws, offended multiple gods, and triggered a supernatural manhunt. Because in ancient Egypt, tomb robbing wasn't just a crime. It was an existential offense. You weren't just stealing valuables. You were shattering someone's shot at immortality. And that made you public enemy number 1 in this world and the next. Step 1, the curse. Before the law even touched you, the tomb itself did. Tombs were designed with psychological warfare in mind. Curse inscriptions were carved on walls and sarcophagi. He who disturbs this tomb shall have his heart devoured in the afterlife, his name erased, and his family fall into despair. That's not just poetry. That's a spiritual lawsuit. The ancient Egyptians believed your name had to survive for your soul to live on. So being erased from memory, worse than death. And a tomb curse didn't wait for a judge. It kicked in immediately. You might trip. You might fall ill. Your crops might die. Your child might speak in tongues. The gods weren't subtle. So now you're sick, paranoid, and probably seeing shadowy jackal-headed things near your goats. And you haven't even been arrested yet. Step 2, the law. Once you're caught, and you will be, because robbing tombs was usually a group affair and someone always snitched, you don't just go to jail. You go on public trial. And these weren't polite court hearings with scrolls and quiet judges. They were theatrical, brutal, and designed to scare everyone watching. You'd be dragged before priests and officials, interrogated, beaten, just for clarity, of course, and made to confess in writing. Some robbers' testimonies were literally found on papyrus, complete with detailed confessions like, "We broke the seal. We took gold. I watched while he smashed the head of the statue. And the punishment? Mutilation. Death by impalement. Burning alive. Rare, but spicy. Execution followed by erasure of name. Sometimes you weren't even buried. A double insult, since no burial equals no afterlife. But here's the kicker. Even if the court didn't get you, the curses would. And everyone believed it. One account tells of tomb robbers whose children were born with deformities, or whose livestock died mysteriously. Whether true or not, the message was clear. The gods finish what the court starts. And still, people kept robbing, because poverty is powerful, and tombs were basically gold-stuffed bait. Even official workers on royal tomb projects were caught looting graves they helped build. So the law added more layers. Guards, hidden tomb entrances, secret decoy chambers, legal edicts read aloud in temples warning, "Let he who violates the house of eternity be cursed in life and beyond." Imagine getting arrested, and while they cuff you, a priest shows up like, "Just so you know, before we execute you, we invoked Anubis. Enjoy your afterlife. You won't have one. That's not justice. That's multidimensional vengeance." Being married in ancient China was less about love and more about maintaining cosmic order, like trying to preserve the balance of the universe while also being expected to cook. So, birth sons and absolutely never speak out of turn. Marriage was not a partnership. It was a bureaucratic agreement between families. You were expected to be obedient, quiet, fertile, and basically invisible unless a relative died and someone needed a professional mourner. You'd think with all that pressure, there'd be at least a little wiggle room for humanity. But no, because in ancient China, if you were a wife and got just a little too comfortable voicing your thoughts, asking questions, or, God forbid, speaking more than your husband thought reasonable, you could legally be divorced for talking too much. Yes, that was a real law. Ancient Chinese legal codes had an actual list called the 7 grounds for divorce. These weren't metaphors. These were official reasons a man could dump his wife back at her parents' house like a faulty clay pot. And nestled right in there among the usual ancient hits like, "She didn't give me a son," or "She got sick and now she's bad luck," was a glowing, screaming reason that basically read, "She won't shut up." The official term was usually translated as gossips too much or talks excessively, which was ancient polite speak for she had opinions. You didn't even have to say anything scandalous. You could just be loud, or sarcastic, or chatty with the neighbor lady, or ask your husband why he smells like another woman, or say the wrong thing in front of your in-laws, or God's help you raise your voice during a disagreement. And just like that, he could divorce you, not because you cheated or committed treason, just because you made too much noise with your mouth. And did women have the same right? Could they say, "He drinks too much," or "He gambled away our rice storage," or "He has 7 concubines and thinks I'm the problem"? Of course not. This is Confucianism, baby. Harmony was the goal, and harmony meant you shut up while the men made the rules. Now, technically, there were a few exceptions to this verbal death trap. If you had mourned his parents properly, or if you didn't have a home to return to, or this one's a crowd favorite, if you had already given him a son, then legally he wasn't supposed to kick you out. So there you go. Your child is both your only joy and your only insurance policy. Congratulations. But don't get too comfortable. If he really wanted you gone, there were always ways. He could just accuse you of being too talkative, and unless your father was rich, noble, or terrifying, you were out. Divorced, banished, sent back home in shame, with your dowry gone and your social status dropped to not worth a goat. Try remarrying after that. It's not happening. You're now considered unlucky, and probably loud. And for the record, this wasn't just a village custom whispered in courtyards. This was imperial law, passed down through dynasties, reinforced by scholars, written into codes that courts referenced while sipping tea and nodding sagely at the concept of domestic obedience. The irony, of course, is that men in ancient China were allowed to lecture, recite, argue, and debate their way through life like human megaphones. They could run academies, issue scrolls, and ramble on about the Tao for hours. But the moment a wife had something to say about household affairs, she was one syllable away from getting legally deleted. So yes, in ancient China, you could be divorced for gossiping. Not for poisoning your husband, not for arson, but for chattering, for talking back, for making noise in a world that wanted you silent, smiling, and ideally pregnant with a boy. And if you're wondering how women dealt with this, some went full silent mode. Some whispered their frustrations into embroidery. Some wrote secret poems. Others, the brave ones, just talked anyway, and hoped their sons would grow up before their husbands ran out of patience. But most just held it in. Because when you live in a world where your voice can cost you your home, your family, and your future, the safest bet was to smile and say nothing. Let's talk about rules. Not regular rules. Not the don't steal your neighbor's goat kind of rules. No. In ancient Israel, we're talking about rules that came straight from the divine hotline, etched into stone, written with fire, shouted from mountains, and backed by the kind of cosmic authority that didn't just smite you. It made everyone watch. So imagine you're a guy living in the desert with Moses and friends. You're just trying to survive. You wake up one morning, the sun's baking your face off, your feet are full of dust, your family's cold, and, oh look, the firewood's out. So, being the brave, helpful soul you are, you wander off and gather some sticks. And boom, you're dead. Not immediately, of course. First, someone sees you carrying sticks on the Sabbath. That's your first mistake. Because in ancient Israel, the seventh day wasn't just a day off. It was the sacred weekly do not disturb. No work, no cooking, no fetching water, and absolutely no stick collecting. Breaking that rule wasn't just a scheduling error. It was a violation of a divine covenant. Cosmic crime. Now, let's be clear. This isn't some metaphorical punishment. This happened. It's in the book of Numbers. A man, unnamed because apparently names are for survivors, was caught gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And the people weren't sure what to do with him, because, while it was obvious he'd broken the Sabbath, no one knew exactly how hard God wanted to come down on him. So they locked him up, consulted with Moses, and Moses, like a good middle manager, went straight to the top. He asked God, "Hey, what do we do with Mr. Firewood?" God's answer? Stone him to death, publicly, because apparently picking up a bundle of twigs on the wrong day of the week was a crime so serious, it required immediate communal execution. So they took the guy outside the camp and everyone threw rocks at him until he died. For sticks, for trying to stay warm, for helping out, because Sabbath law wasn't just sacred, it was non-negotiable. Now, this isn't about firewood. It's about obedience. The Sabbath was a symbol, a line in the cosmic sand. God had created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, so everyone else was expected to follow suit or face, well, rock-based consequences. And that's the thing about ancient theocratic law, it didn't care about intent. Didn't matter if your family was cold. Didn't matter if you were just trying to help. The rule was clear. The punishment was divine. And once you broke it, the entire society became your executioner. It gets even darker. The public execution part? That wasn't just about punishment. That was theater. It was about reminding everyone watching. This is what happens when you treat holy law like a suggestion. So every time someone saw a bundle of sticks lying around on a Saturday, they'd think twice. They'd think about the nameless man who got erased from history for doing what any reasonable person would do, try to build a fire. And centuries later, people would look back and say, wow, ancient Israel was so advanced, so moral, so just. Sure, until someone needed a little kindling. Ah, the Aztecs, builders of pyramids, masters of calendars, and absolute overachievers when it came to mixing religion, law, and bloodshed. These were people who believed the sun needed fresh human hearts to rise each morning. So naturally, they had very strong feelings about how and when you could enjoy a drink. Enter pulque, the sacred, milky, mildly sour, fermented nectar of the agave. Pulque wasn't just alcohol, it was divine. Literally, there was a goddess of drunkenness and also a god of pulque, and honestly, that should have made drinking feel like a religious experience. But here's the catch. The Aztecs took their divine buzz very, very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that if you got publicly drunk and weren't old enough to be collecting wrinkles like they were medals, you could be executed. Not fined, not scolded, not sent home to sleep it off. Killed. Why? Because to the Aztecs, alcohol was a double-edged obsidian blade. On one side, it was sacred, a ritual tool, a bridge to the gods. On the other, it was dangerous, a threat to discipline. And the Aztec Empire was built on discipline. Everyone had a role, place, a duty. Warriors were expected to fight. Priests were expected to bleed. Farmers were expected to sweat. And citizens? They were expected to keep it together, especially in public. So here's the deal. If you were young and healthy and got caught stumbling around the marketplace, singing to toads or trying to fight a statue, that wasn't just a bad look. It was treason against the social order. And in a society where order was basically oxygen, treason meant one thing: death. But if you were old, and not just I pulled something getting off the floor old, but truly, visibly, gloriously aged, then congratulations. You earned your pulque privileges. In fact, it was encouraged, because the elderly were seen as wise, respectable, and spiritually closer to the ancestors. And if they wanted to get plastered in public and reminisce about the time they helped skin a sacrificial victim or survived a drought, let them. Drunkenness, in that case, wasn't disorder, it was ritual expression. They weren't just drinking, they were honoring tradition. But the moment a youth tried to pull that off, out came the law. And the law said, you drink, you die. It didn't matter if it was your birthday, or if you were mourning, or if you just had a rough day building temples. There were no second chances, no plea deals. One cup too many, one stagger in the wrong direction, and you were being offered up as an example. The irony? Pulque was everywhere. You could smell it in the streets, see it bubbling in clay jugs. It was part of ceremonies, part of feasts, part of temple rites. It wasn't forbidden, it was sacredly regulated, which is honestly so much worse. And you didn't even have to be blackout drunk to qualify. Even visible tipsiness could get you arrested, which meant the safest way to enjoy a drink was either behind closed doors, or with enough gray hair to frighten the gods. Of course, there were exceptions. There were always exceptions. Priests could drink during rituals. Warriors could get a pass at victory feasts. Nobles could bend the rules. But for the average citizen, public intoxication wasn't a funny story. It was a death sentence with a hangover you didn't survive. So next time you raise a glass, just remember, in Aztec society, if you weren't old enough to have arthritis, you weren't old enough to have a second round. And if you did, you weren't just making a scene. You were committing a crime against the divine order. Cheers. You're dead. You know, a civilization means business when it turns mutilation into a bureaucratic chore. Welcome to ancient Assyria, where the kings were terrifying, the punishments were creative, and somewhere, buried in all that imperial glory and blood, was a man whose actual job was removing eyeballs. Legally, with state approval, possibly with some kind of ceremonial title, like ophthalmic compliance officer. Because in Assyria, eye gouging wasn't just a punishment. It was policy. Let's be honest. Ancient Assyria didn't mess around with leniency. This was an empire that proudly displayed relief carvings of torture in public places, like motivational posters for the violently ambitious. And while other civilizations might settle for imprisonment or fines, Assyria went with the classics. Flaying, impalement, and yes, the old gouge the eyes out special. But here's the part that makes your stomach churn in slow motion. This wasn't some random mob justice thing. No, it was structured, organized, reproducible. The laws of the land specifically included eye removal as a standardized penalty, especially for crimes like theft, assault, or disrespecting the state. And who do you think carried out those punishments? That's right, someone whose daily grind involved staring into a terrified face and going in elbow deep with something sharp. This wasn't back alley revenge. This was state-sanctioned ophthalmic violence. There were protocols, techniques, probably some on-the-job training, maybe even union dues. Let's say you stole something from the palace, maybe a shiny bronze tool or some grain you swore nobody would miss. In Assyria, the king didn't want to waste a prison cell on you. That would cost resources, food, time. Instead, one public trial, one official sentence, one visit from the eye guy. The best part? You probably saw him coming. Literally. Right until you didn't. And don't think this was done in secret. Oh no. Public punishments were theater in Assyria. You were the performance. The audience, your neighbors, your family, probably some bored officials eating dates and taking notes. You were a walking, screaming cautionary tale. But here's the sick genius of it all. Eye gouging was designed to disable, not kill. You could still work, still pay taxes, still be led around like a political puppet to remind everyone else what happens when you cross the line. And make no mistake, Assyria was all about lines. Lines you didn't cross. Lines drawn in blood and law and fear. If you were a citizen, you lived under a system where the human body was a ledger, and crime meant subtracting a few parts. And in the middle of it all, some poor soul got promoted or possibly just sentenced to the worst job in the empire, the guy who makes sure the sentence sticks. Eyeballs included. So if you ever feel like your job is rough, just remember there was once a man in Nineveh whose job description included, must be good with knives, steady under pressure, and totally fine with screaming. A guy who probably went home at night, washed his hands in silence, and prayed nobody in the crowd recognized him without his hood. Because yes, Assyria made eye gouging a legal profession. Not an accident. Not a punishment gone rogue. A state function. And somewhere in some dusty administrative scroll, there's probably a record of who did the job, and how many they did in a week. Sleep tight. There are fashion statements. And then there's Roman purple. A color so expensive, so exclusive, so stupidly symbolic that if you wore it without permission, the state didn't just judge your taste. They considered it a political threat. In ancient Rome, putting on the wrong shade of purple could get you exiled, imprisoned, or executed. All because you looked a little too much like the guy on the coins. Let's back up. In the Roman world, purple wasn't just a color. It was a power trip in dye form. And not just any purple. This was Tyrian purple, made from the crushed glands of tens of thousands of tiny sea snails that bled a specific shade of reddish-violet. Each garment cost the equivalent of a luxury car. You didn't wear it because you liked the hue. You wore it because you were loaded, important, or literally Caesar. Now, imagine you're an ambitious Roman merchant. You've made some money, you've got a villa, and your ego's been lifting weights. You see a bolt of purple cloth in the market, and you think, why not me? So you buy it. Maybe it's just a trim. Maybe it's a tunic with a dash of royalty. Maybe you're feeling extra bold and go full toga. Congratulations. You just committed treason by wardrobe. Because Roman law, especially during the Empire, strictly regulated who could wear purple and how much. A thin stripe on your tunic? Okay, if you were a senator. A wider stripe? Reserved for consuls. But full-body imperial purple? That was emperor-only territory. You weren't just overdressed, you were overstepping your societal rank. And Rome didn't take that lightly, because in a culture obsessed with hierarchy, fashion wasn't self-expression, it was a legal identifier. Your clothes told the world exactly how much power you had. And if you pretended to have more than you did, that wasn't vanity. That was an attempted coup with embroidery. Some emperors were chill about it. Others, not so much. Nero naturally was unhinged about it. Domitian, paranoid. Diocletian, he basically locked the color purple in a vault. There were actual imperial decrees forbidding anyone from wearing Tyrian purple unless you were part of the ruling household. Violators could be stripped of their rank, wealth, citizenship, or just executed for good measure. And it didn't stop there. Even dye merchants were under surveillance. If you were caught selling imperial purple to commoners, you weren't just a bad businessman. You were a co-conspirator in fashion-based sedition. The Romans feared one thing more than barbarians: imposters with good tailoring. It gets more ridiculous. At one point, during the later empire, just dreaming of yourself in purple could raise suspicion, because it meant you were aspiring to power, thinking treasonous thoughts, manifesting ambition through textiles. Yes, Rome made color illegal if it gave off the wrong vibe. So what did people do instead? They settled for less lethal colors. Off-brand purples, muddy reds. They walked a fine line between fashionable and flayable. Rich men hired slaves to whisper, "Not too regal, sir," before leaving the house. Because in Rome, fashion didn't just get you noticed, could get you beheaded. So next time you throw on a purple hoodie and stroll outside without a second thought, remember, in ancient Rome, your drip could get you executed for trying to match the emperor. And no, not even the snails would save you. There's nothing quite like standing trial while a priest stares at Venus to figure out if you're guilty. Welcome to the legal system of the ancient Maya, where calendars were sacred, time was divine, and the stars didn't just guide farming and rituals. They decided if you were a criminal. Forget fingerprints, eyewitnesses, or even a good old-fashioned bribe. In the Mayan world, your best shot at justice wasn't a lawyer. It was the sky. See, to the Maya, time wasn't just linear, it was cosmic. Every moment was tied to gods, omens, and celestial patterns. If you were born on a bad day, well, tough luck. If your trial fell on the wrong glyph in the calendar, also bad luck. And if Mars was looking angry while you were accused of theft, that might be enough to call you guilty by constellation. And no, this wasn't just spiritual fluff on the side. It was baked into the process. Judges didn't just sit there with scrolls and scowls. They sat with priests who could read the Tsoken calendar like it was a divine spreadsheet. They'd consult glyphs, count the days, read the celestial mood. If your date of birth lined up with an unlucky deity, that was already a red flag. Combine that with a lunar eclipse or a solar flare, and suddenly you weren't just a suspect, you were cosmically doomed. Imagine getting hauled into court for a land dispute. You've got a solid case. Your neighbors back you up. You even brought a chicken as a peace offering. But then the priest consults the stars and mutters something about Kauk Day during the Trecina of 9. The judge frowns. That's not good. That's a war god's shadow. Suddenly your chicken's not helping. You're not just in legal trouble, you're in astrological hell. And it worked both ways. If the stars were in your favor, you might walk free, even if everyone saw you do it. Kill a man in public? If you did it on a day ruled by a justice god, you might argue divine favor. And if the judge agreed, that wasn't just a good day. That was divine vindication. Now, you'd think people might challenge this. Hey, maybe we shouldn't let the position of Jupiter decide who gets sacrificed today. But no, this was a society where the calendar literally ran everything. Festivals, taxes, sacrifices, battles, marriages, trials. The sky wasn't decoration. It was law. And it wasn't just astrology for the accused. The judges themselves had to be born under certain days. Their spiritual alignment mattered. A judge born under a trickster sign? Probably not getting the job. One born under a day of balance and justice? Welcome to the court. Now go decide whether this farmer dies because his neighbor says his cornfield is 2 feet too wide. So there you are, standing in a dusty courtyard, trying to look innocent while a man in feathers and paint reads your fate from the heavens. You're not worried about your alibi. You're worried about whether today is ruled by a crocodile god with anger issues. If it is, well, hope your afterlife has good seating. Because in Mayan law, you didn't just break the rules, you disrespected the cosmic schedule. And when you mess with the calendar, justice comes down like a flaming serpent from the stars. And that, apparently, was fair. In ancient India, truth wasn't just a virtue. It was cosmic law. It was dharma, the moral glue that held the universe together. Lying wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered a threat to the very balance of existence. Which sounds noble, right? A society built on honesty, spiritual integrity, divine order, beautiful stuff, until you check the fine print. Because buried deep in the sacred codes, nestled between verses about duty and righteousness and respecting cows, there's a loophole so wide it might as well be a golden chariot. If you were a Brahmin, lying wasn't just allowed. It was sometimes encouraged. That's right. In a civilization that literally believed truth-telling was the path to salvation, the priestly class, the men who ran the temples, wrote the rules, and claimed to be humanity's hotline to the gods, were granted a neat little exemption from the whole don't lie thing. Need to trick a merchant for religious purposes? Fine. Need to manipulate a warrior to keep the social order? No problem. Need to lie during a ritual to keep the magic working? Go ahead, the gods will understand. Because apparently when Brahmins lied, it wasn't really a lie. It was a spiritual adjustment. The justification? Simple. Brahmins were considered the highest of the 4 varnas, the top of the caste pyramid. They were said to be born from the mouth of the cosmic being Purusha, while everyone else came from the arms, thighs, or feet. So if truth was sacred, and Brahmins were sacred, then anything a Brahmin said must also be sacred, even if it was completely made up. It's like divine logic wrapped in a paradox. Thou shalt not lie, unless you're the person who wrote that commandment. And this wasn't a secret. Ancient legal texts like the Manusmriti flat out stated that Brahmins could avoid punishment for lying if it was done in the name of religious duty or maintaining social harmony. Meanwhile, if a Shudra, the lowest caste, told a lie of any kind, whip him, burn his tongue, chop off body parts, because nothing says justice like truth for thee, not for me. Even better, If a lower caste person told the truth in a way that offended a Brahmin, that could be punished too. Imagine speaking honestly in court, and the judge says, "Yes, what you said was accurate, but you said it in the presence of a sacred person, and now we have to remove your jaw." And this wasn't limited to the courtroom. Lying Brahmins were tolerated in commerce, politics, marriage negotiations, and rituals. They had an open tab at the honesty buffet, and they used it with all the subtlety of a flaming chariot. So next time someone tells you ancient India was a land of peace, wisdom, and universal truth, well, it was mostly, just not equally. If you were a Brahmin, truth was flexible. If you weren't, truth was a trap, one that came with consequences if you stepped out of line. But don't worry, a Brahmin would be happy to explain it to you, loudly, with authority, and just enough fiction to keep the gods smiling. Tax season is stressful. Even today, it can make you break out in cold sweats, curse the heavens, and wish you'd been born a goat instead. But at least modern tax collectors don't show up to your house with a knife and a fire pit. Ancient Carthage? Not so merciful. Because in Carthage, if you tried to cheat the treasury, the government didn't just take your property. They might take your child, walk him up a stone staircase, and sacrifice him to the gods. Yes, that happened. Carthage wasn't just a trading superpower or a naval empire or Hannibal's weekend retreat. It was also a deeply religious society, and its god Baal Hammon didn't do second chances. If you wanted prosperity, military success, or even halfway decent weather, Baal Hammon required payment, and not the metaphorical kind. We're talking full-blown, ritual human sacrifice, with a heavy emphasis on burning children alive as an act of devotion. Now, to be fair, not every kid in Carthage was a candidate. Just the ones whose families really needed to prove something, and that often meant the rich. When crops failed or wars went badly, the elite were expected to step up and show their loyalty with the ultimate offering. And nothing said, "I'm sorry, Baal. I'll do better," like tossing your heir into the flames. So what happens when you add taxes into that already deeply cursed recipe? Well, historians suggest Carthage's upper class wasn't just sacrificing out of piety. Sometimes they were forced to do it as punishment, because if you tried to withhold your dues from the state, or fudge your numbers, or redirect temple funds into your private wine cellar, the state didn't just call it fraud. They called it sacrilege. And sacrilege had fiery consequences. Think about it. The same temples that collected taxes were the ones running the sacrifices. Religion and state weren't two separate lanes in Carthage. They were the same chariot, pulled by very sweaty oxen and fueled by divine rage. If you lied on your tax documents, you weren't just stealing from the treasury, you were insulting the gods. And you don't insult Baal Hammon unless your family has a sudden surplus of children and a very bad survival instinct. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of tiny burial urns filled with cremated remains of infants and young children, carefully buried in rows with inscriptions like "to Baal," in payment of a vow. And while some scholars argue about whether all of them were sacrifices or just very unfortunate early deaths, the message is still clear. In Carthage, divine wrath was a line item on your budget sheet. And the truly horrifying part? It was institutionalized. There were priests who specialized in sacrifice. There were musicians hired to drown out the screams. There were ceremonial altars designed to slide victims directly into the flames. This wasn't some fringe cult practice. It was mainstream fiscal policy, just with more fire and fewer spreadsheets. So next time you grumble about your tax bill, remember, you could have been a merchant in Carthage, trying to hide a little profit from the temple, and ending up watching your legacy go up in smoke. Literally. Because in Carthage, if you crossed the gods and the IRS at the same time, there was no audit. There was only the fire. You wake up in ancient Athens. The sun's shining, the wine's watered down, and your neighbor's face could curdle milk. But don't worry, This isn't just your personal suffering. It's a legal matter. Because in the land that gave us democracy, philosophy, and sculpted abs on marble statues, being too ugly wasn't just unfortunate. It was grounds for public litigation. Yes. In ancient Greece, particularly in the golden age of Athenian civic pride, physical appearance wasn't just aesthetic. It was political. The Greeks were obsessed with symmetry, proportion, and that sculpted, oily gods would envy this kind of perfection. To them, beauty wasn't skin deep. It was a reflection of moral character, intelligence, and even citizenship status. So if you looked like you'd been slapped by 12 generations of bad decisions, you might find yourself in court. Now, this wasn't exactly spelled out in some ancient fashion police scroll. There wasn't a no uglies beyond this point sign at the city gate. But it crept in through laws about public office, public speaking, and even jury selection. You couldn't just be competent, you had to look the part. A face like a dropped amphora? That was considered a threat to public order. In fact, some people were barred from holding public office or giving speeches in the assembly because they were considered physiognomically unfit. That's a fancy word for, you look like a traitor. The Greeks actually believed that you could judge a man's character by his bone structure. If your eyes were too small or your nose was crooked or your mouth hung open like a stunned donkey, someone might accuse you of being lazy, corrupt, or downright dangerous. And then there were the comedies, which weren't just for laughs. They were public character assassination disguised as theater. Politicians were dragged through the mud not for their policies, but for their appearance. Aristophanes didn't just roast leaders. He turned their looks into national security threats. And people cheered. Imagine attending a comedy play where your senator is mocked for having a lopsided face, and instead of suing for defamation, he gets removed from office. But the real kicker? You could literally be sued for being ugly if it disrupted civic harmony. If you made a public scene and your appearance was offensive enough, someone could claim you were polluting the city. No, really. Greek society had a concept called miasma, ritual pollution. It applied to murderers, oath breakers, and apparently people whose faces were just too difficult to look at before lunch. It wasn't about vanity. It was about order, harmony, balance. In a society that worshipped the ideal form, a severely ugly citizen was considered a crack in the marble of perfection. You weren't just unattractive, you were untrustworthy. So what did you do if you were born with a face that could start a war, and not the Helen of Troy kind? You stayed quiet. You avoided public roles. Maybe became a stonecutter or a philosopher with a really big beard. You certainly didn't run for office, because your political opponents could literally argue that your face alone made you unfit to govern. And don't get smug, thinking, well, at least we've evolved, because 2,000 years later, people are still judged for their looks. The difference is now it's just Twitter instead of the Athenian courts. So yes, ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, math, and theater, also believed in a kind of legal hotness requirement. And if you didn't pass the vibe check, you were out. Because sometimes the biggest crime was being born without cheekbones. Let's say it's ancient China. You've had a long day hauling rice, dodging tax collectors, and pretending your in-laws don't exist. You finally sit down for a bit of human connection, and what spills out? A little rumor, a tasty sliver of court scandal. Maybe your neighbor's daughter is secretly married. Maybe someone said something rude about the emperor's nose. Nothing crazy, just words. Congratulations, you just bought yourself a permanent facial tattoo, courtesy of the state. Because in ancient China, particularly during the early dynastic periods and under various legalist regimes, gossip wasn't just a social faux pas. It was a crime. And not just any crime. It was a moral infection, a political disease, a threat to the carefully balanced social order built on hierarchy, obedience, and shutting your damn mouth. And the punishment? Emoshing, criminal tattooing. That's right. The Chinese government invented a form of cancel culture that physically branded you for life. If you got caught gossiping, especially about the government, nobles, or your social betters, you could be hauled into court and tattooed across the face or forehead, usually with characters that meant things like criminal, slanderer, or scum. No filters, no makeup, just public, permanent shame. And you didn't even need to be spreading false information. That's the fun part. Even true gossip could be punishable if it was deemed socially destabilizing. Because the goal wasn't to protect truth, it was to protect order. The emperor was divine. The bureaucracy was sacred. And your nosy little whispers about who's sleeping with whom? That was practically sedition. Imagine trying to explain that at dinner. Uncle Lee, what's that symbol on your face? Oh, that? I said the tax collector had weird eyebrows. Now I'm branded for eternity. And this wasn't just a slap on the wrist kind of thing. Emoshing was usually one of the 5 punishments, a serious tier of state-sanctioned suffering that included flogging, exile, and mutilation. Tattooing was reserved for crimes that needed a lifelong reminder, so everyone who looked at you would know. Here lies a mouth that talked too much. Oh, and removal? Forget it. This wasn't a henna design. This was carved or inked deep into your skin, in visible places, often the forehead, where no amount of rice powder or hair fringe could hide it. It followed you into the fields, the marketplace, the afterlife. A walking, breathing warning label. And yes, other crimes were also tattoo-worthy. Theft, desertion, corruption. But gossip was special. It showed that you couldn't be trusted, not just with property, but with social cohesion. You weren't just a liar, you were a potential virus. And the cure was state-sponsored graffiti. The irony? Imperial courts were riddled with gossip. Eunuchs whispered secrets. Nobles plotted in hushed corners. Concubines played emotional chess with each other. But that kind of gossip? That was elite strategy. Your village rumor about someone's stolen chicken? That was a punishable offense. So next time you think ancient Chinese law was all about philosophy, balance, and calligraphy scrolls, remember that it also involved slapping tattoos on people's faces for talking trash about their neighbors. Because in the eyes of the empire, silence wasn't just golden. It was survival. Speak out of turn. And the only ink you get is shame right between your eyes. You've just lost your husband, or maybe your father, or your great-uncle you met once at a sacrifice and avoided ever since. Doesn't matter. The man is dead, and you're now part of the Roman mourning machine, an ancient bureaucratic grief factory where women were legally required to cry. Not just cry, wail, howl, and publicly unravel for an entire month. Welcome to the Roman Republic, where even your breakdown came with rules. In the earliest Roman legal code, the 12 Tables, there was a law that literally regulated how much mourning was allowed, and more importantly, how loudly it had to be performed. Because in Rome, death wasn't just personal. It was performative. And grief? That was a woman's job, scheduled and standardized like a tax audit. You were expected to sob in public. Loudly. For 30 days straight. No breaks. No, I cried into my wine already. Can I go home now? Excuses. The louder your shrieks, the more respectable your devotion. And if you didn't hit the right decibel level, people talked. Did you hear Flavia didn't even tear out her hair? So heartless. Forget internal sadness. This was about public optics, and the patriarchy was watching with a clipboard. But don't think this was some solemn spiritual tradition. It was theater. The Romans hired professional mourners. Entire squads of women whose sole job was to show up, cry their lungs out, scratch their faces, and scream the name of the dead like they were trying to resurrect them by volume alone. These women were the original grief influencers, and yes, they were judged on performance. Bonus points for collapsing dramatically. And if you were an actual family member, congratulations. You didn't just have to cry, you had to cry better than the hired help. Because your tears were measured against expectation. 1 month of mourning was the minimum for a woman. If you stopped early, that was suspicious. If you smiled too soon, definitely suspicious. If you wore anything other than the regulation black, someone would report you to the elders, and you'd be marked as a cold-hearted, unfeminine disgrace. This law, by the way, wasn't about honoring the dead. It was about controlling women's behavior, because the 12 tables weren't subtle. They told you who could own what, who could speak in court, and yes, how long you were allowed to publicly grieve before it became a nuisance. That's right. The same law that required women to cry for a month also included restrictions on how extreme the mourning could get. No excessive weeping. No tearing your own cheeks too violently. No rending your clothes if you couldn't afford a replacement. Rome wanted regulated despair, emotional devastation, but make it state-approved. And just when you think it couldn't get weirder, elite funerals became full-blown mourning competitions. Who could cry the loudest? Who fainted the best? Who had the most dramatic, poetic monologue while clutching an urn? The grieving widow became a status symbol, a tear-soaked accessory to the family's legacy. And if she didn't perform, the community might assume she didn't love the dead man at all. Or worse, she wanted him dead. You'd think death would bring freedom, but nope. Just 30 days of scheduled sobbing under the watchful eye of tradition. So yes, Roman women had to cry. Legally, publicly, strategically. And if you couldn't summon the tears, too bad. Get some onions. The Republic is watching. Picture this. You're living in ancient Anatolia. The Hittite Empire is buzzing with activity, pun fully intended. And you've just had a brilliant idea. Steal your neighbor's bees. Maybe you're hungry. Maybe you're just feeling chaotic. Maybe you underestimated how seriously these people took their honey supply. Either way, you grab the hive, run for your mud brick life, and hope no one notices. Big mistake. Because in Hittite law, bee theft was a crime so severe it had its own section in the legal code, sandwiched somewhere between punishments for adultery and rules about oxen. That's right. The Hittites didn't just value bees. They legislated them. Why? Because bees weren't just cute little honey makers. They were economic assets, industrial livestock, the ancient equivalent of liquid gold with wings. Honey wasn't a luxury, it was medicine, currency, and sometimes even a religious offering. So if you stole someone's bees, you weren't just a nuisance. You were committing agricultural blasphemy. And the punishment? A hefty fine, usually measured in silver or livestock, depending on just how many bees you swiped and whether the queen was still intact. The more valuable the hive, the more your sticky-fingered crime cost you. The Hittites even distinguished between stealing bees and damaging bees, because of course they did. Smashing someone's hive might cost you less than abducting it whole, but not by much. Also, this wasn't some obscure village law whispered about in apiary circles. This was imperial decree, etched into clay tablets with all the gravitas of military law. Imagine standing in court while a priest judge reads off your charges. Accused, unlawful seizure of pollinators. Penalty, 2 goats, 1 silver ring, and public humiliation. And don't even think about arguing. But they flew into my yard. Hittite law knew your tricks. There were rules about ownership boundaries, bee migration, and whether you were luring hives away on purpose. That's right. Ancient bee rustling was real, and if you pulled it off too well, it could cost you your farm. What's even better, this law wasn't about protecting the bees. It was about protecting the bee owner. Animal rights? Please. This was about sweet, profitable honey and the guy who claimed it. The bees were just innocent bystanders in your little Bronze Age heist. But still, think about it. An ancient civilization, known for its brutal war chariots and massive stone fortresses, also sat down and wrote with absolute seriousness, "Do not steal the bees, or else." And you can bet someone did steal bees. Someone angered a beekeeper with friends in high places, and the next thing you know, there's a fine on the books and a law carved into history. That's how serious the Hittites were about their buzzing economy. So yeah, next time you think ancient laws were all about murder, land, and goats, remember this. In the Hittite Empire, the wrong kind of buzz could cost you your livelihood. Steal a cow? Harsh but expected. Steal bees? Now you've gone too far. You're a Sumerian merchant. Your grain shipments are late, your ox dropped dead in the middle of a trade route, and you've racked up more debt than you can repay in this lifetime. Literally. So what does your lender demand as compensation? A wedding, not to their daughter, not to their cousin, but to their dead son. Welcome to ancient Sumer, where debt wasn't just a financial matter. It was spiritual leverage, and marriage to the deceased was a legitimate legal workaround. Yes, ghost weddings were real. And no, you didn't get a haunting honeymoon. What you got was a contractual obligation to a corpse, and somehow this was supposed to fix everything. This wasn't just a fringe superstition. In Sumerian society, the dead were considered active members of the social structure. If a man died without heirs, it wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a cosmic administrative error. His name couldn't continue. His spirit might wander. And worst of all, his debts might remain unpaid. The horror. So if the family owed money or if someone owed them, the solution might involve arranging a marriage between the deceased and a living bride. This woman would become the ghost's wife, often symbolically, sometimes even with a formal ceremony. No, there wasn't exactly a ghost at the altar, but there was usually a contract, ritual offerings, and a strong belief that this union tied up the spirit's unfinished business, financial and otherwise. And don't think you got out of this just because your spouse was incorporeal. As the widow of a dead man, you were now legally part of his household. You might live with his family, serve them, produce children with someone else in his name. Yes, that was a thing. In some cases, the woman would bear children with a brother or male relative of the deceased, and those kids would be legally registered as the ghost's offspring. That way, the dead man got his heirs, and everyone moved on pretending like this wasn't deeply unsettling. So what does this have to do with debt? Everything. Because sometimes, a creditor would demand a ghost marriage as repayment, particularly if they believed the dead person had cursed them by dying with unresolved debts. The marriage was a spiritual apology, a ritual IOU. It settled the cosmic account books by acknowledging that, yes, the spirits still mattered, and no, they weren't being forgotten. You'd think this was rare, right? Nope. There are clay tablets detailing contracts where women are offered in marriage to deceased men as part of inheritance or debt agreements. Some even include provisions for what happens if the woman refuses, usually involving legal penalties or worse, spiritual consequences. You didn't just disappoint your in-laws. You risked haunting the entire household. And what if the bride had her own plans? Fell in love with a living man? Wanted to, not be eternally tethered to someone buried under a pile of bricks? Tough. Ghost marriages weren't about romance. They were about honor, continuity, and bookkeeping with a supernatural twist. So yes, in ancient Sumer, money troubles could absolutely end with a wedding to someone 6 feet under. Because in a world where the dead still counted, settling a debt wasn't just financial. It was familial. It was ritualistic. It was hauntingly final. Imagine this. You've lived your whole life hauling stones, building pyramids you'll never be allowed to enter, harvesting grain for a pharaoh who thinks he's literally the sun, and dodging hippos, crocodiles, and divine judgment on the regular. You finally managed to scrape together enough silver, beer, and goat-based goodwill to afford a small tomb. Nothing fancy, just a modest rectangle in the dry earth where your bones can rot in peace. And then the tax collector shows up for your tomb, because in ancient Egypt, even dying cost money. Tombs weren't just emotional security blankets for the afterlife, they were real estate. And as far as the state was concerned, if you owned real estate, you owed. It didn't matter if your tomb was a grand limestone monument or a sad little pit with a sketch of Osiris drawn in charcoal. You were now a taxable entity, dead or not. And this wasn't just a symbolic offering to the gods situation. This was bureaucracy, papyrus scrolls, stamped receipts, and grumpy officials with styluses tracking who had paid their necrotic property fees. That's right. The same civilization that invented mummies also invented tomb property taxes. So if you thought buying your final resting place was the end of your financial stress, think again. Ancient Egyptian law demanded that you pay for the space, the location, and sometimes even the decorations. Want some hieroglyphs? Pay up. Want your name inscribed in gold? Double. Want a statue of Anubis guarding the door? That's a whole different tax bracket. And if you died before paying it off, too bad. The debt didn't die with you. Your family inherited it. Because nothing honors your memory quite like your son getting shaken down by temple accountants while you're busy being embalmed. Even the priests got involved. Temples weren't just spiritual centers, they were landowners. They often sold burial plots, leased tomb space, or outright owned cemeteries. So in a deeply ironic twist, you paid the gods rent for the privilege of rotting in their backyard. Oh, and the state knew exactly how to find you. Egyptian census records didn't just include the living, they kept tabs on who owned what tomb, where, and whether it had been properly maintained. Let your tomb fall into disrepair? That could trigger another fine. Your corpse might be at peace, but your ledger wasn't. And this wasn't a rare or elite-only thing. The middle class, scribes, merchants, skilled workers, all scrambled to prepay or post-pay for their graves. Some even took out tomb loans. Yes, you heard that right, loans for the afterlife. With interest. Meanwhile, the pharaoh? He gets a pyramid the size of a mountain, paid for with national resources, peasant labor, and divine justification. You get a dusty bill and a warning not to skip offerings this month. So next time you think death is the great equalizer, remember, in ancient Egypt, your journey to the afterlife came with a receipt. And if you didn't pay up, well, maybe that's why so many tombs ended up cursed. Imagine this, you're a scribe in an ancient royal court. Your whole life revolves around ink, reeds, scrolls, and a back permanently bent at a 45-degree angle. You've trained for years to write flawlessly, one elegant symbol at a time, because every mark you make is official, sacred, and legally binding. Now imagine you're halfway through a scroll meant for the king, and your tired hand slips. Instead of writing "Great Pharaoh Divine Ruler of the Two Lands," you accidentally leave out a title or worse, misspell the royal name. You don't get a chance to fix it. You get a death sentence. Because in many ancient civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Imperial China, and others, writing wasn't just a job. It was a sacred act, and the names of rulers weren't just words. They were symbols of cosmic order. To write them incorrectly was to break that order, and the penalty wasn't a stern talking to. It was execution. Take ancient Egypt, for example. The pharaoh's name wasn't just political branding. It was believed to carry magical power. The cartouche that held the royal name was sacred, and messing with it meant you were inviting chaos into the world. Some scribes were punished severely for writing the pharaoh's name without proper titles, honorifics, or hieroglyphic flourishes. Scribal handbooks from the time are less style guides and more manuals for not dying painfully. And heaven help you if you accidentally crossed out a name. In Egypt, to strike through a royal name was the same as trying to erase them from existence. Literal damnatio memoriae, erasing someone from history. That was treason, with all the bone-breaking, tomb-denying consequences it came with. Over in China, things weren't any safer. The emperor's name was protected by naming taboos, strict laws that banned commoners from even writing or saying the sovereign's name unless absolutely necessary. A misplaced character in a document could be interpreted as an insult to the throne, and entire families were sometimes punished for what boiled down to an accidental stroke of a brush. Some dynasties even had scribes who were executed for writing the emperor's name too casually, or for accidentally omitting a stroke in a calligraphic flourish. Imagine dying for a missing dot, a typo so deadly it gets you beheaded in front of your peers. And don't think you were safe if you tried to correct it. Scratching out errors was considered defacement of a legal document, even worse than the mistake itself. You weren't allowed to rip up scrolls either. Once the name was on paper, the scroll was sacred. Mistake or not, it now held power. Power you weren't authorized to mess with. Some rulers even had their names written with special characters that could only be used by court scribes, and even those scribes had to go through elite training to learn the correct brushstrokes. Failing the exam? Not just a career setback. In some periods, it was a punishable offense. And this wasn't limited to kings. Religious leaders, temple gods, even high-ranking officials had their names protected by law. Write the wrong name on a deed? You're now a forger. Spell the wrong title in a legal dispute? You're slandering nobility. Guess what the punishment was? Spoiler: it wasn't a warning letter. So yes, in a world where writing was rare, sacred, and powerful, a single mistake could mean your life. No backspaces, no whiteout, just ink, law, and the looming threat of execution. Imagine being a kid in ancient Sparta, not a child, really more like a trainee in the art of sanctioned violence and barely controlled starvation. You're sent to the Agoge, Sparta's infamous military training system that turned boys into brutal warriors and lunch into a distant memory. Food? That's earned. Warmth? Optional. Mercy? Not in the syllabus. And if you're hungry, there's only one solution. Steal something. But here's the twist. The stealing part wasn't the problem. Getting caught was. That's right. In Sparta, theft was part of the curriculum. Boys were trained, literally trained, to sneak, snatch, and survive by their wits. Steal a piece of bread from a market stall? Good. That shows initiative. Steal a fox and hide it under your cloak until it claws your guts out? Even better. That shows commitment. But if someone sees you do it, you're not punished for stealing. You're punished for being stupid. Because Spartan law wasn't interested in your moral compass. It was interested in whether you had the skills of a good soldier. Cunning, stealth, discipline. If you could steal without being noticed, you were useful. If you got caught, it meant you lacked the basic tactical instincts of a decent warrior. And in Sparta, that was worse than theft. It was embarrassment, treason against excellence. Even the punishments were designed to drive the point home. Caught stealing? You'd be whipped, publicly humiliated, and told to do better next time. And yes, that happened even if you were stealing because you were starving. That was the whole point. Hunger was part of the training. They wanted you desperate. A real Spartan doesn't ask for food. A real Spartan takes it and makes sure no one sees. There's a famous, horrifying story about a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his tunic during inspection. Rather than reveal the theft and face disgrace, he stood perfectly still while the animal gnawed through his abdomen. He died without a sound. That was considered heroic. Not the theft, the silence, the self-control, the dedication to stealth over survival. Because in Sparta, everything, even your internal organs, was expendable if it meant you upheld the ideal. Obedient, disciplined, and undetected. And this wasn't just kid stuff. The mindset carried over into adulthood. Spartan warriors were expected to be resourceful, always on the lookout for weakness, in enemies, in systems, in supplies. A soldier who couldn't outwit his opponent off the battlefield was just as useless as one who failed on it. Sparta didn't reward honesty. Sparta rewarded results. So yes, stealing in Sparta was completely fine. Just don't be clumsy. Don't be loud. And above all, don't get caught. Because if you did, the whip came out. And the lesson was simple. Next time, be better at crime. Imagine living in an ancient court, let's say Persia or Assyria, or one of those royal palaces where the king didn't just rule by decree. He breathed in divinity and exhaled execution orders. You're a humble servant, just trying to carry a tray of pomegranates without shaking too loudly. You enter the throne room and, oh no, your eyes accidentally meet His Majesty's. You looked. You're dead. Because in some ancient kingdoms, eye contact with the king was literally a capital offense, unless you had a royal invitation or a death wish. And we're not talking about a long, defiant stare. We're talking any glance, a flick of the eyes, a moment of human recognition. That was enough to get you dragged out by guards and executed before your heart even finished panicking. Unless, of course, you were blind. Yes, blindness was basically a legal loophole. If you had no eyes or no vision, you were excused from the do not perceive the divine law. Some rulers even surrounded themselves with blind musicians, blind attendants, and blind scribes because they were considered safe, unable to accidentally insult the king with a glance, and therefore perfectly loyal. And don't think this was just superstition. Oh no, this was law, written down, enforced. The ruler's face was seen as holy, often considered too sacred or too powerful for mere mortals to gaze upon. Looking at it was like challenging the sun to a staring contest, except the sun didn't have a beheading squad on standby. Persian kings, for example, were treated like living gods. According to some accounts, even high-ranking officials had to cover their mouths in his presence and keep their heads bowed at all times. If you lifted your gaze without permission, that could be interpreted as treason, insubordination, or just plain blasphemy. This no-looking rule wasn't limited to the Near East, either. Some African and Southeast Asian monarchies followed similar practices. In certain ancient kingdoms, entire courtrooms were constructed to hide the king from view. Veils, curtains, raised platforms. Anything to prevent the commoners from laying eyes on his majestic, execution-triggering face. There's even evidence that some kings were never seen by the public at all. Their image was sacred, secret, and politically weaponized. You didn't see the king. You saw his symbol, his voice, his royal messengers, his giant golden sandals. But not him, never him. And yet, the blind were exempt. They could walk freely, sit closer, serve near the throne, because their inability to see made them the least threatening humans in the room. You couldn't insult the king with a look if you couldn't look at all. So yes, in some ancient kingdoms, your life hung on the direction of your eyeballs. One glance could mean instant death, but no vision at all? That was job security.